May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Most couples who come to me to talk about getting married, and I see a few here whose weddings I've officiated, they're not looking for advice. They want to talk about the ceremony. Well, at least the brides do. The grooms are often not sure if they want to talk to a priest at all. But the church requires me to spend time with every couple I marry. And honestly, I would want to do so even if it wasn't required, because I genuinely want to know about them, their hopes, their dreams, their fears. Anyway, in addition to getting to know each other and to talking about the ceremony, we also talk about those questions couples should ask before they marry, or at least wish they had. These questions cover topics ranging from whether or not they want children and how many, to matters financial, to the dynamics of their families of origin, and everything in between. But there's a topic that's not directly covered in the questions, which I feel it is important to discuss, and which compels me to give to the couple the only real piece of advice that I give about marriage. The topic is forgiveness. I know couples whose basic position about forgiveness is this: that they can forgive the other almost anything except. And the except is big. A line in the sand that must not be crossed. And if a couple has thought about this, although I suspect that many don't really think about it until after the wedding day, that exception is one thing and one thing only: infidelity. As I said, most couples don't come to me looking for advice, and I'm not inclined to give it about marriage. But on the topic of forgiveness, I'm not inclined to be silent. And although love-blind brides and grooms probably pay me little mind when they hear me say it, my advice to them is to begin their married life with no line in the sand. No exception established in either's mind from the outset, for which forgiveness could not be sought, could not be offered. Not even if there is infidelity. No exceptions at all. This is not to say that I believe there are never circumstances in which a marriage could and should rightly end in divorce, sad though that always is. I'm only saying that couples should not begin their married lives certain that there is something the marriage could not survive for lack of forgiveness. My rationale for this piece of advice is found in what I believe and know have experienced about God, that there is no line in the sand, no exception to God's forgiveness. And that even in the simple prayer Jesus taught us to pray, we ask God to forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And I think husbands and wives and partners ought to mean that when they say it, or at least try. Now, brides and grooms-to-be have to sit and listen to my only piece of advice, premised on a lesson about God. But almost no one else has to hear it, except, of course, a captive congregation sitting through a sermon. And you may or may not need to hear advice about forgiving your spouse, your partner, your friend, perhaps your enemy. But if you are anything like me, you do need to be reminded of the lesson about God. Because many of us have somehow absorbed the idea that ours is a God who has drawn lines in the sand. Our shorthand for this is to remember that we have heard it said that God is an angry and jealous God. To us, this sounds like a God who has all manner of boundaries that may not, must not, cannot be crossed, or else. And indeed, we have many images of such an angry and jealous God who fills the skies with thunderclouds and lightning bolts as he prepares to wreak his vengeance on those who cross him and his line in the sand. But today, Jesus has advice for those of us who believe this about God. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil?" He replied, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year, until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. If not, you can cut it down." If I could only take one of Jesus' parables with me to a desert island, this would be it. Because the fig tree, of course, is me, or you, if you care to put yourself in the story. It requires no real stretch of my imagination to see that I have not been the person I could be, that I have not done all I could with the gifts God has given me, that in so many ways I have failed to bear the fruit of good works and kindness and love that God has made me for and calls me to. Maybe you could say this about yourself as well. The season of Lent is in some measure given to us to reflect on the ways we resemble the fig tree in this parable. Notice that we don't even have to get to the things we have done wrong, although I believe we are free to remember those and would benefit from doing so. It's enough to think about what we have failed to do, those things we have left undone, as we say. Have I been faithful to God in prayer? Have I been available and responsive to those who need my help? Have I been generous to those who deserve my assistance? Kind to those who seek my friendship, my fellowship? Have I been available to those who need me and can rightly lay claim to that need? Have I been gracious to those who just happen to find themselves in my sphere? Sometimes we have such low expectations of ourselves that we do pretty well by these measures until we begin to expand our focus and see more of the world around us, the people we normally ignore or have already shut out, those beyond the immediate company of our family and friends. But God's expectations of us, they are not low at all. God has always called his people to be welcoming to strangers, to care for those who are needy, not because we know them, but just because they are in need. And to love not only those whom it's easy for us to like, but even to love our enemies. So if this is the kind of fruit we are to bear in our lives, how are we doing? Now, in the cartoon version of life that has become the common picture for so many these days, I am now supposed to rail at you from this pulpit about your many failings in these ways. I'm supposed to encourage your shame, identify you as sinners, affix a scarlet letter to your clothing, condemn you to a life of guilt, and threaten you with the fires of hell. In this cartoon world, dour nuns wield stiff rulers to whack children's hands. Hypocritical priests hurl accusations at the innocent, suffering poor. And a greedy church takes from you what you can ill afford to give in order to fill her hallways with extravagance. And no doubt, the church has been guilty of all these cartoon crimes at one time or another. But there is still the matter of the fig tree, which has failed to bear fruit year after year after year. No one has guilted the fig tree about anything. No one berated it when it was young. No one took from it what was rightfully the tree's and deprived it the chance to produce figs. No, the tree was just planted and left to grow and do what fig trees do, produce figs, which are sweet, wonderful, delicious. But year after year, the tree gives no figs. The owner of the tree remembers that he heard once that ours is an angry and a jealous God. And he remembers, too, that he is made in God's image. His is a selective memory. A fig tree ought to produce figs. Its owner has every right to expect them, he thinks. What's the point of a figless fig tree, after all? So cut that tree down and teach it a lesson that will no doubt be noticed by all the other fig trees too. Where's that axe? But there is also a gardener, or at least someone who we think is the gardener, though he looks a little familiar to me, come to think of it. And this gardener is not the type to draw lines in the sand. Is he disappointed by a fig tree that bears no figs? Perhaps. Is he prepared to give up on it and cut it down? No, he is not. Does he believe a good, strong dose of guilt or haranguing or the threat of eternal damnation will induce the tree to grow figs? It doesn't appear so. But the gardener has a pile of manure, and he has time. And he has a way with the owner of this tree. Sir, he says, let it alone one more year until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, well, you know. In my cartoon world on my desert island, where this is the only parable I have to tell, it is told over and over, year after year. The exasperated owner remembers that this is the third, no fourth, no fifth, no 20th year in a row he's had this conversation with the gardener. But always he relents, neither as angry or as jealous as he had at first seemed. And in my cartoon world, there is an endless supply of manure to be heaped on this fig tree by the gardener to help it grow, help it thrive, help it bear much fruit. And of course, in my cartoon world, I am the fig tree, peering out from beneath my leafy but so far figless branches. And I have heard the demands of the owner year after year after year. I have remembered that he sounds so much like a jealous and angry God. But I notice that he always listens to the gardener. And I am grateful. Grateful that there is a pile of manure for me, because it's hard to draw a line in a pile of manure, to define the limits of what the gardener will tolerate, what he will put up with, what he will forgive. Indeed, to me, on my island, he seems to have no limit, no line that cannot be crossed. He seems to me to have nothing but patience and plenty of manure to try to keep me humble and to coax my limbs to finally bring forth fruit and to offer the first figs to him.